those of you, okay, for those of you whom I haven't met, my name is Olga. I'm a lecturer in gender studies at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. And together with Kathy and Polly, I'm co-creating this series, like this Solidarity Dialogue series. And today it is my great pleasure to welcome Maria Mayerchyk and Olga Plakhotnik. And there will be their session today. But before I go and introduce Olga and Maria, I'd like to say a couple of organizational things. So we will start with my introduction of Olga and Maria, or Maria and Olga, sorry, in that order. And then Polly will also say a few words, like reflecting on our first conversations that Kathy and I had on Thursday, and like building a bridge to the new one, to today's conversation. And after that, Maria and Olga will get into their talk. But I think that I will still introduce them at the moment. And yeah, it is my very great pleasure to welcome Maria and Olga here today, because I know both of them for quite some time, and we have worked together on different occasions, like on a small scale occasions, let's say, and I always appreciate their writing and their opinion, although they quite often go against the stream, I would say, and I think they know this very well, yes, and the cost of this as well. Yes, and Maria, and today they will talk about the difficult affinities at the war-torn buffer periphery. And by this, they will talk about the Russia-Ukrainian war. I'll start with Maria. Maria Mayerchyk has a double affiliation as a senior research associate at the Ethnology Institute of the Ukrainian Academy of Science, and as a visiting scholar at the University of Greifswald in Germany, where I got my PhD, by the way, but it's a coincidence. But yeah, she holds the Candidate of Sciences degree in history with a specialization in ethnology. Maria taught courses on gender, queer and feminist studies and Slavic culture and folklore in Canada and Ukraine. And Maria was also a recipient of fellowships at Harvard University, Lund University, University of Alberta, University of South Florida, and others. Her research interests include critical folklore studies, diaspora studies, East European studies, ethnography, queer and feminist epistemologies, and decolonial option. Olga Plakhotnik holds a Candidate of Sciences degree in philosophy from the National Aerospace University in Kharkiv, Ukraine, and a PhD in sociology from the Open University in the United Kingdom. She or they taught and conducted research projects in the area of feminist epistemologies and methodologies, feminist and queer pedagogies, contemporary feminist, LGBTI+, and queer activism in Ukraine. Currently, Olga is a joint editor-in-chief of the refereed journal Feminist Critique, East European Journal of Feminist and Queer Studies, and Olga's current research project examines imaginaries of sexual citizenship on the Ukrainian-Russian borderland, how identities and belongings are negotiated in LGBTI+ communities in wartime. And I also would like to say that Kathy uploaded many texts in the folder for the students, and among them, there are also texts from Olga and Maria. So there will be the lecture today, but then also you can read the previous scholarship as well. Yes, I'm happy. Again, I'm very happy to have you here today. And now I give the word to Polly, who will introduce your talk in a more meaningful, content-wise way.
I think that the words I want to say will be sort of looking back on what you and Kati talked about at our first session, and it's by way of thanks to you. And I just wanted to, this is for the benefit of people who were not here, because those of you who were here will know what I'm going to say. So you framed this we have framed this in terms of dialogues on solidarity. And in fact, what unfolded at the first session was precisely the making of solidarity. And it was so interesting to see how the two of you, Kati and Olga, were in dialogue with one another and brought us into the conversation. And I just was so impressed with the way you were talking about dialogue and the way it was actually happening and unfolding with our participation. So thank you for that. And a few things have stayed with me that you talked about. One was that the emphasis on feeling and affect and how important this is in these kinds of dialogues and solidarity, making solidarity. And also at one point, I think it might have been Kati who brought up the issue of failure and vulnerability. And it occurred to me that this is what really distinguishes solidarity. There must be this emphasis on, or a mindfulness about feeling, and also one makes oneself vulnerable already by entering into these dialogues, and that is what would distinguish it from an academic lecture, say, where it would be inappropriate to bring too much feeling, and certainly it's harder to demonstrate vulnerability in that kind of context. So thank you so much for introducing this series by making solidarity with us, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what Maria and Olga are going to say to us. Thank you.
Can we start? Thank you very much. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Polly, for such a generous introduction. We also are grateful to all for who put together such an wonderful series on solidarities. And thank you, Kati and Olga, for inviting us. We are glad to be a part of this project. And of course, thank you all for coming. And now I'll share my screen. And start presentation. Okay. So our presentation is entitled Difficult Affinities at the War-Torn Buffer Periphery, and consists of 3 parts. First, we will show a short video and comment on it. It will be the case that is relevant to our topic and helps to start the conversation. Second, we will dig deeper into theory and offer a new theoretical framework for reading the case, the presented case. In the third and the final part, we will think about a new reality we are living in, more specifically, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Our presentation will last for about, I think, 40 minutes, and then we will proceed with the discussion. Part 1, the case. A short video you will watch in a minute tells a story that took place a decade ago. On August 17, 2012, a 22-year-old activist of famine group, Inna Shevchenko, used a chainsaw to cut down a cross located near the central square, which is well-known Ukrainian Maidan Nezalezhnosti in Kyiv. It was a massive cross made of wood, bearing the figure of Jesus Christ. The other famine activists used ropes to direct the fall of the cross. And here is a brief video of the performance.
что хотели акции, если не скажу?
Ни одна бизнес-структура, даже такая успешная, как церковь, не имеет права покушаться на права женщин. За свободу женщин, за свободу Pussy Riot. Пока свободы нет, я должна бежать. Извините.
Okay, that's it. As you could see and probably hear in the video, after bringing the cross down, Shevchenko stated, "No business, not even one as successful as the church, has the right to attack women's rights." End of quote. This protest had a clear reference. It was staged at the time when a court in Moscow, in Russia, was due to deliver a verdict on Pussy Riot members for performing a political punk prayer at the altar of Moscow's main cathedral. Slogans written on the bare breast and arms of the feminine activists read "Free Riot." You can see it in the picture. On their Live journal page, in Live journal was a popular Russian-based social media, Femen explained that they cut the cross as an act of solidarity with the Russian feminist group Pussy Riot. Femen called on, and I quote, "all forces in society to mercilessly sow out the rotten superstitions from their minds that support dictatorship and prevent the development of democracy and freedom of women." End of quote. The action caused resentment in Ukrainian society. Activists were accused of being profoundly immoral. Shevchenko started receiving death threats and soon fled the country. Other Femen members also experienced an increasing hostility from the police and fled Ukraine as well. At the same time, Ukrainian society tried to avoid association with the conservative Russian rhetoric on offense of religious feelings, hence promptly offered a new, plausible and secular argument. It was stated that the cross was erected to memorize victims of Stalin's repressions. Probably the cross was associated with victims of repressions indeed. However, it was not a matter of common knowledge. No sign or explanation was ever attached to the cross. It was just a regular wooden cross, like many others that were erected in many public spaces by church, an enormous, powerful institution. There was no shared understanding to whom the cross belonged, and no evidence if the cross was erected legally. And yet, an odious Ukrainian president, Viktor Yanukovych, criticized Femen using the same rhetoric that was used in the Russian court against Pussy Riot. 2 months later, after the performance, on October 17, 2012, he met with religious organizations and launched a tirade against what he called, and I quote, "the act of barbarism." And further, I quote Yanukovych's speech. "Society trusts the church, and yet we cannot say that the consciousness of all people could make us feel calm for the morals of society. I mean, particularly various incidents that are resonant sometimes. For example, when a cross was cut down in the center of Kyiv, and thus the religious feeling of millions of people were offended." End of quote. Yanukovych concluded by saying that the cross desecration merits, and I quote, "the toughest response from the police." End of quote. Given that at that time, members of Pussy Riot were given 2-year prison terms on similar charges of hooliganism motivated by religious hatred, Yanukovych's words could be a signal that famine must also face a criminal investigation. Okay, but what we are telling you this story. Soon after the court, several interviews with Maria Alyokhina and Nadezhda Tolokonnikova were recorded by different media. Pussy Riot activists were asked about famine's action of solidarity. Because we did our research on famine at that time, we listened to these interviews and remember the Pussy Riot's response vividly. Unfortunately, today we couldn't find an original video of the interview and now use quotations available in secondary sources. When asked about the Famine's act of solidarity, Maria Alyokhina said, and I quote, "We share the same sudden appearance and protest against authoritarianism, but we look at feminism differently, especially this concerns the forms of our actions. We have never undressed and never will. The latest action, cutting down the cross, unfortunately, doesn't create any feeling of solidarity," end of quote. And I'll repeat this quote in Russian, the language of original. Нам близки внезапность появления и протест против авторитаризма, но мы иначе смотрели на феминизм. Прежде всего, это касается формы выступления. Мы не стали бы раздеваться и не станем. Последняя акция спиливания креста не вызывает, к сожалению, чувства солидарности. In other words, Famine's act of solidarity was not accepted by Pussy Riot. The quoted statement of the Russian activist went viral in Ukrainian media, adding to general condemnation and denunciation of famine activism. We would like to dwell on this response a little bit and analyze it in greater detail. Some academic publications explain this rejection by misinterpretation of Pussy Riot's message by famine. Scholars underline that famine's action represented Pussy Riot as an activist group, while Pussy Riot repeatedly claimed that they had been criticizing not religion as such, but the church as an institution. This suggestion was offered by Katerina Widlak and Masha Neufeld in the article entitled "Lost in Translation, Pussy Riot Solidarity, Activism, and the Danger of Perpetuating North/Western Hegemonies." The paper was published in 2014. We basically do not argue against this conclusion. Famine might misinterpret the Pussy Riot's performance, but we would like to take one step further and ask what else could it be except misinterpretation? Whether or how colonial imperial relations play their part in this episode of the rejected feminist solidarity. Our suggestion is that Russian activists' reaction to the Ukrainian act of solidarity was not free from structurally conditioned imperial superiority. In other words, activists from the imperial center simply were not interested in the activists from the periphery and their support. This can be seen better if we analyze Pussy Riot's rhetoric on the matter. For example, Maria Alyokhina's answer that famine's action does not create any feeling of solidarity sounds peculiar given that it was famine who expressed solidarity. It looks like famine were perceived as too insignificant to support Pussy Riot. Another inconsistency can be found in the recurrent denial of the strategy to go topless. It was not the only occasion when Maria Alyokhina indicated that Pussy Riot would never undress because topless protest commercializes the female body. This claim contradicts, however, the fact that Nadezhda Tolokonnikova did participate in the nude action called Fuck for the Hair Puppy Bear in Moscow in February 2008, when activists engaged in public sexual intercourse. So the tactics of nude and sexualized protest were not that much unthinkable. After all, the word pussy in the Pussy Riot name plays the same role as bare chests in feminine activism. They use what is the most accentuated in the female body by dominant discourse to create a protesting message. Finally, Pussy Riot's statement that they do not accept feminine strategy of nude protest because it commercializes the female body contradicts their acceptance of dozens of other solidarities. For example, Pussy Riot never rejected solidarity from Madonna and many other Western celebrities who, unlike Femen, do commercialize and sexualize the female body. Later on, Pussy Riot themselves used sexualized female body in their video projects as a tool for their political statements, but we are not going into detail here. We have made our point. We are talking about discrepancies and peculiarities in the Pussy Riot's narratives, not to catch their on lie or hypocrisy, but pointing at all these details, we want to show the difference in Pussy Riot's perception of solidarity depending on who expressed it. The rejected Femen, who, by the way, paid a very high price for their act of solidarity, pointing at issues that appeared not to be issues when performed by Western celebrities, who actually got political credits for their solidarity. We would like to mark this difference as a structurally conditioned imperial superiority. Concluding this part, we want to stress our acknowledgement of Pussy Riot as one of the few people and groups who stood up against Putin's regime. If there were more people and groups like Pussy Riot, we perhaps could have been able to prevent the war. What we are saying here is that the most progressive, open-minded, and brave activists in Russia are not free from the imperialist perspective and are hardly aware of it. When we discuss activist affinities, we often refer to such important concepts as intersectionality, critical perspective on racism. We speak about queer and feminist solidarities, but there is also structurally conditioned ongoing imperial superiority, which is not covered precisely by any of the mentioned frameworks and yet intersects with all of them. In order to grasp this entanglement, we are introducing a concept of buffer periphery. This analytical concept may help us theorize feelings, positionality, and situatedness of feminist activism of so-called non-historical nations, or we can also say not imperial nations in Eastern Europe. And Olga will continue. It's part 2.
Part 2, buffer periphery. Our entry point here is the colonial framework that emerged to theorize the history of Latin America and Caribbean region colonization by Western Europeans. The main figures of the colonial thinking are Aníbal Quijano, María Lugones, Sylvia Wynter, Enrique Dussel, Arturo Escobar, and many others. One of the central concepts of the colonial option is coloniality. Coloniality is, and now I quote Aníbal Quijano, still the most general form of domination in the world today. Once colonialism as an explicit political order was destroyed, end of quote. In other words, the colonial framework suggests differentiating colonialism, that is political order that to a significant degree has been overcome, and coloniality. Coloniality is a fundamental matrix of power which continue operating today through the control of four interrelated domains: economy, authority, or governmentality, it was the second, gender and sexuality was the third, and production of knowledge and subjectivity. Capitalism and racism are two foundational and interrelated axes of coloniality. Because coloniality is a global condition that affects all local histories, the application of the colonial option to East and Southeast European region proved to be very productive. This growing body of scholarship includes works by Manuela Boatka, Marina Grzinic, Piro Regzepi, Kiesza Kanzler, and others. The examples of such studies could be found in a recently published book and 2 issues of the Feminist Critique journal that we are showing you now on the screen. So the book is in the middle. We published a chapter there, but there are like 2 or 3 dozens of other excellent chapters working on this topic. And on the right and on the left, there are 2 issues of the Feminist Critique journal, and Kati was a guest editor of one of them, and we are very glad to publish this special issue. It's great. Inspired by the growing decolonial scholarship on Eastern Europe, we introduced the concept of buffer periphery to grasp the experience of territories that constitute a periphery of not only the Western-centered world, as it is in the West and the rest post-colonial framework, but 2 empire formations, namely the global West and Russian imperialism. This is the case of Ukraine, which, as political scientist Yulia Yurchenko noted in 2020, and I quote, fell victim of the relentless spread of the empire of capital, where Russian and Western capitalist geopolitical imperialisms collided, end of quote. While acknowledging that there are many Wests within the West versus Russia imperial differences, we follow Edouard Glissant's view of the West as a project, not a place, end of quote. With respect to Ukraine, the hegemonic Western stance is rather unified. While our study is focused on the domains of activism, feminism, sexuality, and subjectivity, the theoretical framework of buffer periphery can be relevant in many other contexts, where non-imperial communities, that is, communities that entered modernity without being imperial nations, at least for some time, find themselves at the intersection of imperial interests of 2 or more globally dominating forces. The possibility of decolonial resistance in the buffer periphery is particularly challenging. The ceaseless contest between 2 empire formations for control and knowledge, governmentality, economy, and subjectivities requires a constant analytic vigilance, not to be seized by one or another colonial discourse. We need the lens of buffer periphery to avoid those traps and focus critically on both imperial formation simultaneously while developing emancipatory discourses. An additional complication might appear as a result of the necessity to resist nation-state thinking, or time of nation, as we call it elsewhere, in a world where the imaginary of nation-states is naturalized and taken for granted. In this situation, the nation as a community and the nation as a state can be easily confused, and critical emancipatory thinking might become hacked or seized or even co-opted. Part 3, the war. How does our theorizing of and from the buffer periphery work in the situation of ongoing military aggression? Let us start with an example. In mid-March 2022, a manifesto entitled Feminist Resistance Against War was published online and gathered about 3,000 signatures from across the world. You probably met it somewhere. The manifesto narrative, sharp and concise, sounds very appealing to everyone familiar with the feminist anti-militarist stance based on the critique of global capitalism and the war economy. We were particularly fascinated by the following statement, I quote, "We demand the immediate cancellation of Ukraine's foreign debt of $125 billion as a concrete measure of support for the Ukrainian people and denounce the reforms and conditionality imposed by the IMF in recent years," end of quote. This is a very bold statement, which sounds like a critique of both Western and Russian colonial capitalism. However, the overall manifesto's perspective projects the war in Ukraine as a conflict between two imperialisms, where Ukraine is nothing more than a pawn in a global power game. In other words, the serious problem with the manifesto is that it perpetuates knowledge production from imperial centers and subjectivizes peripheries. Peripheries can subscribe to the suggested knowledge or not, but they are basically offered a voiceless position. This kind of knowledge cannot overcome coloniality. The manifesto's positionality cannot provide a firm basis for solidarity because the dominant forces enabling wars remain intact. The manifesto was met critically by many Ukrainian and some Western scholars and activists. All of them pointed out that the manifesto denies Ukraine's agency. Solidarity with Ukraine, organized by Judith Butler and Sabine Hark. However, developing their critique of the manifesto, the mainstream feminist discourse quite often remains grounded in the nation-state paradigm, i.e., understanding the nation as a state in contrast to the nation as a community. Sadly, this positionality perpetuates the logic of war. Expressions like pacifism kills or anti-militarism kills, voiced by Ukrainian feminist scholars and activists, are not infrequent today. In this situation, many feminists around the world are confused or do not see the ground for solidarity. Now we would like to stress that understanding anti-militarism as a one simple and decontextualized answer to all possible challenges is a mistake. Anti-militarism is a framework and a way of thinking that is essentially important amidst a war. Anti-militarism means prioritizing people, defending lives, caring, fighting racism, resisting vulgar heroization, understanding that heroes do die, and we as a nation, as a community, must prevent as many deaths as we can. The demand "Arm Ukraine" voiced today by mainstream Ukrainian feminism doesn't reflect all these nuances. Without further elaboration and sophistication, it perpetuates the logic of war and death. Looking from the perspective of the buffer periphery, we can see that while struggling against the Russian invasion, Ukraine is still subjected to the colonial power of two empires. Behind the soothing rhetoric of brave Ukrainians defending their independence, we can see how Ukrainians are being sacrificed. They are sacrificed when, until recently, the West sold weapons to Russia. They are sacrificed when the West gives weapons to Ukraine. They are sacrificed when the West buys Russian gas and oil and fuels for the war machine. To sum up our presentation, we want to underline that Ukrainian feminism is not homogeneous. Some feminist positions and views are more critical, more visionary, and more nuanced. They might not be seen and heard in the same way as mainstream narratives. It is a result of decades of neoliberal politics of NGOization of political activism in Ukraine. The war has worsened the situation of the minoritarian grassroots feminist initiatives even further, making them even more silenced and invisible. But in our view, this is the place where transnational feminist solidarities might occur and help to stop the war. Thank you. I stop now, and I would like to show a couple of other slides now. This is some references. This is some publications we cited or we relied upon, and I think this presentation will be available further. And another slide actually shows the list of 3 our articles, where we elaborate in more detail on the topic of buffer periphery, feminist activism, and solidarities. Thank you very much, and we're ready for your questions and suggestions and thoughts. Yeah.
Great, thank you very, very much. I'd